Boa tarde a todos, todas, todes. A minha função aqui é simples, eu vou apresentar, tenho aqui a orgulho e a alegria de apresentar as duas participantes dessa mesa, a Julieta Gonzalez, em primeiro lugar, diretora artística do Museu Jumex, na Cidade do México. Ela já ocupou cargos curatoriais no Museu de Arte de São Paulo, no Museu Tamayo, na Cidade do México, no Bronx Museum, na Tate Modern, no Museu de Belas Artes de Caracas e Museu Alejandro Otero. Ela organizou mais de 60 exposições em todo o mundo, entre as quais vou mencionar apenas algumas: Memórias del Desarrollo, no Museu Jumex, Juan Downey, a Communication Utopia, no Museu Tamayo, além de participar como co-curadora ou curadora convidada de exposições internacionais, como a Bienal de Lyon, em 2007, Inside San Diego, Tijuana, em 2005, e a Bienal de Praga, em 2003. Ela é mestre em Estudos Culturais e Teoria Crítica pela Goldsmith, em Londres. Julieta, muito obrigada, muito bem-vinda.
Boa tarde. Muito obrigada ao MASP pelo convite para falar dessa exposição que eu fiz para o projeto do Getty, do Pacific Standard Time, Latin America and LA. Eu vou falar, infelizmente, em inglês, porque foi a informação que recebi, mas podia ter feito em espanhol, mas eu prefiro ler quando falo em público. Mas vou dar uma pequena introdução em português sobre a exposição, uma exposição para a qual a pesquisa durou uns 5 ou 6 anos. Para mim começou como um projeto mais bem de reflexão sobre essa produção da América Latina que estava sendo consignada ao conceptualismo, somente. Para mim era um nicho, uma categoria que resultava insuficiente para entender a complexidade desses câmbios de paradigma que se sucederam na América Latina nessas décadas dos 60, nos 70 e 80. E comecei também a pensar nesse momento, nos anos 2000, que muitos artistas contemporâneos da minha geração estavam falando do fracasso da modernidade. Então, pensar em assumir-se dentro do subdesenvolvimento e com outras epistemologias que não sejam aquelas da modernidade, e também tem que ver com uma descoberta no começo dos anos 2000 desses textos do grupo Modernidade, Colonialidade e Descolonialidade, e pensar como esse conceito da colonialidade foi instrumental também para pensar nesse fracasso da modernidade, que não é tal fracasso, essa modernidade não era viável. Então, bom, após essa pequena introdução, eu vou ler o meu paper, que está, infelizmente, em inglês, mas, bom, fazemos logo as perguntas em português. Obrigada. Memories of Underdevelopment, as I said before, was a project I organized in the framework of the Getty Pacific Standard Time Latin America in LA initiative last year, which then traveled to Museo Jumex in Mexico City, where it was on until a month ago. It is an exhibition and a research set within a particular historical moment that took as a starting point the height of the modern project in Latin America and its unraveling in the following decades. The exhibition examined the major paradigm shift in culture and the visual arts, characterized by the articulation of a counter-narrative to the rhetoric of developmentalism during the 1960s through the 1980s, when a series of economic crises brought down the economies of the region, evidencing the failure of the application of developmentalist policies in the prior decades. This was a time when the problem of underdevelopment was at the forefront of social, economic, political, and cultural concerns throughout Latin America, most notably through the contributions of dependency theory, which basically posited underdevelopment as part and parcel of the modern capitalist world system, that, far from being eliminated by the implementation of developmentalist models, would only be perpetuated and maintained by them. André Gunder Frank, one of the major exponents of dependency theory, devoted the first chapter of his book, América Latina, Subdesarrollo o Revolución, precisely to this problem, titling it The Development of Underdevelopment. We must conclude in short, and I quote Gunder Frank, we must conclude in short that underdevelopment is not due to the survival of archaic institutions and the existence of capital shortage in regions that have remained isolated from the stream of world history. On the contrary, underdevelopment was and is still generated by the very same historical process which also generated historical development, the development of capitalism itself. And I close quote. Inscribed in this context, the research for the exhibition had several interrelated objectives. On the one hand, to draw the connections between the artistic practices produced during that period, characterized in a great way by a departure from the formal language of modernism to a resistance to the rhetoric of developmentalism, which, along with a heightened awareness of the social and political context, informed many of these practices. 2, to enlarge the scope of analysis of these works and practices beyond the framework of the conceptual, be it Latin American conceptualisms or conceptualismos del sur. And thirdly, to identify early instances of decolonial thought in these works in terms of the specific ruptures from the Western canon that characterize this type of production. A critical reappraisal of this paradigm shift today entails considering, as part of its referential framework, the body of theory produced since the early 90s by cultural theorists associated to the modernity, coloniality, decoloniality group. The concept of coloniality, initially formulated by Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano, provides an invaluable theoretical tool for understanding the problem of modernity in Latin America. It proposes the colonial as the obverse but also constitutive side of the European modern rational project, which is not only bound to but also economically sustained by the colonial enterprise that began with the conquest of the New World in the 1500s. Essentially, by equating modernity to the colonial enterprise, the concept of coloniality poses serious questions about the modern project's validity in Latin America. Quijano reprises the ideas advanced by the earlier dependency theory, thus rendering the projects of modernity and development in their perpetuation of colonial structures of exploitation and domination in the region unviable or unsustainable. This contemporary theoretical framework in the expanded field of cultural studies addresses the concerns voiced by political economists in the 1960s and 70s through dependency theory, or theory of underdevelopment, this time at an epistemological level. For Walter Mignolo, the concept of coloniality has opened up the reconstruction and the restitution of histories, subjectivities, knowledges, and languages silenced, repressed, and subalternized by the totality depicted under the names of modernity and rationality. Beyond identifying coloniality as the correlate of the global modernist project, the modernity, coloniality, decoloniality framework has offered theoretical and cultural alternatives through decolonizing strategies, or what they normally describe as delinking. The decolonial option, or delinking, mostly in the form of what has been described as epistemic disobedience and border thinking, are strategies of resistance to a modernity that perpetuates the colonial condition. This type of reflection in the cultural field is not the exclusive province of the modernity, coloniality, decoloniality group. In the 1960s and 70s, Paulo Freire and Ivan Illich aimed to delink from the colonial model with their respective ideas on conscientization and deschooling. Enrique Dussels' philosophy of liberation from 1977 is an important precedent, specifically in terms of presenting itself as epistemic rupture. Néstor García Canclini, in his seminal 1989 book, Culturas Híbridas, proposed strategies to enter and exit modernity. More recently, Boaventura de Sousa Santos has argued in favor of the epistemologies of the South as one that adequately accounts for the realities of the region. And as this research aimed to establish, Many of these strategies had been anticipated in the fields of visual art, architecture, and film across Latin America, beginning in the early 1960s. Memories of Underdevelopment precisely attempted to identify and map these early instances of a decolonial turn in art and culture as an important part of this history. An intensive process of revision has been taking place in the field of Latin American art history during the past 2 decades, which is aimed to dissect the different practices that emerged in the region in the 1960s and 70s. Nevertheless, many of these critical reappraisals have not specifically addressed the role of underdevelopment and the agenda to decolonize from imposed cultural models as key factors in the artistic production of the period, mostly consigning this rich and diverse production within the framework of conceptualism, and ideologically inscribing it as an art produced exclusively in the context of the wave of right-wing dictatorships that spread throughout many countries in the region between the 1960s and 80s, mainly addressing those of Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Uruguay. I mostly refer here to the more recent work carried out by the collective Conceptualismos del Sur, which nevertheless has undoubtedly made important contributions to the critical revisions of art practices in Latin America during this period. While the language of conceptualism does indeed prevail in many of these works produced during this period in Latin America, the underlying presence of underdevelopment is a major concern in the artistic production and theory in the region between the 1960s and 80s, which marks specific concerns such as the shift from the logic of space to the logic of place, an interest in the body, in the sensorium, and notions of affect and experience, the incorporation of the vocabulary of the popular and forms of expression pertaining to marginalized populations, and the notion of the collective, which all played out a major part in defining the research and also in the organization of the exhibition itself. These are issues that also extended beyond the field of art to have an impact also in fields such as pedagogy and art and architecture. A key reference in terms of the revision taking place since the late 90s is the 1999 exhibition Global Conceptualism Points of Origin, organized by Luis Kamnitzer and Rachel Weiss with a team of international curatorial advisors at the Queens Museum in New York. In her catalog essay, Mari Carmen Ramirez outlined some of the parameters under which these conceptual manifestations emerged in Latin America. 1. The failure of the expectations created by the hegemonic project of desarrollismo, or developmentalism, the simultaneous emergence of military regimes. 3. A major shift in the understanding of the role of the avant-garde in the Latin American context, adding that the interplay between the successes and failures of desarrollismo is fundamental to the origins of our conceptualism. Well, I'll elaborate on that later on. And I would add that Luis Kamnitzer's later book, Conceptualism in Latin America, Didactics of Liberation, other than what its title would rightly suggest, it positions the development of conceptualist practices in Latin America within the coordinates of didactics and liberation, a subject that he traces to the writings and ideas of 19th century figure Simón Rodríguez, an anti-colonialist thinker, educator, and tutor of Simón Bolívar, whom he posits as the first conceptual artist in Latin America. This genealogy is also taken up by Memorias del Subdesarrollo in terms of the anti-colonialist positions mapped by the exhibition, which also takes as a point of departure some of the issues raised by Ramirez in her essay on the origins of these conceptualisms, which, however, I try to, in the exhibition, to take out of that framework, because I think there is much more to them than just conceptual operations at the base of these artworks. And addressing in depth problems that had only been partially analyzed until now, such as the specific affinity to the postulates of dependency theory in regard to the colonialist nature of the modern project, and the ensuing turn towards local and popular forms of knowledge made manifest in many of the works featured in the exhibition. To make evident the conditions and context of cultural production was paramount to many of the artists and collectives included in the show. In his essay for the book Retórica del Arte Latinoamericano, CAIC founder Jorge Glusberg stated that works produced in Latin America have, as their essential feature, permanent reference to the conditions of production, or to put it in another way, to the reality of context. In this sense, for Glusberg, rather than there being a Latin American art, there was a common Latin American problem. Aligned with this kind of thinking, Memorias del Subdesarrollo goes beyond considering Latin America as a homogeneous entity or a geopolitical construct, though united by a common colonial past. Rather, it addresses Latin America as a distinct set of avant-garde practices produced in the region from the 1960s onwards in reaction to what was perceived as a recrudescence of colonialism in the continent, enabled by the projects of modernity and development. These avant-gardes, in turn, built upon the legacies of their early 20th century predecessors, who sought to incorporate elements of pre-Hispanic and popular cultures into their discourses in an attempt to resist a canon imported from the West. For many of the artists and collectives presented in this exhibition, it was essential to rethink themselves in the context of these discussions around underdevelopment, as not only did this ideological and epistemic framework reflect the social, political, economic, and cultural realities of the region, it also offered a way to decolonize from an imposed model. Since I've only read a third of my paper and I have 15 minutes left, I'll make a brief summary of. So basically also the exhibition posits how the avant-gardes in Latin America also positions themselves in regard to a European canon of the modern, and the prevalence of the constructive tradition in the early 20th century avant-gardes in Latin America as well, sort of parting from Torres Garcia and his Escuela del Sur, maybe I think I'll read. If it were possible to identify an overarching concern, a common ground for the successive 20th century avant-gardes in Latin America, it is the desire to stake out an identity amidst the contradictory impetuses of modernity, separate from the linear historical narrative of Western culture. The avant-gardes of the first half of the 20th century in Latin America oscillated between cosmopolitan internationalism and the recuperation of national imaginaries. On the one hand, there were those who embraced the modern, finding in the language of abstraction and its imperatives of techniques and invention a universal code that transcended national and cultural boundaries. Others sought out in local forms of knowledge, both pre-colonial and popular, the aesthetic foundations from which to articulate an identity that resisted and defied what was perceived as an imposed canon from the West. And we can think here of examples from Joaquín Torres Garcia's Escuela del Sur and his constructive universalism, which simultaneously promoted abstraction as a universal language, but recuperated indigenous imaginaries as well, proclaiming Nuestro Norte es el Sur. Or Pedro Figari's concept of critical regionalism, and José Carlos Mariátegui's Amauta literary journal, or Oswald de Andrade's Revista de Antropofagia, among many other examples of these wavering concerns during the first half of the 20th century avant-gardes in Latin America. Others sought in local forms, more often than not, these contrasting positions intersected, coinciding in their desire to produce experimental, autonomous, and autochthonous forms of art that radically broke with tradition. The modern, for the avant-gardes of the first half of the 20th century in Latin America, was, however, still an imported and distant experience, enabled by studied trips to Europe or the sporadic visits of European artists, architects, and writers to the region. Social, economic, and political structures in most of the region were still dominated by a landowner class, remnants from the not-too-distant colonial past that persisted despite the independence struggles of the early 19th century. For example, Mariátegui, in his Punto de Vista Imperialista of 1929, describes Peru and other Latin American republics as semi-colonial and semi-feudal. The modern only appeared on the horizon as a possibility of a concrete and local experience in the period between the late 1940s and the mid to late 1960s, characterized by intensive industrialization, urban growth, and the exodus of rural populations to urban centers. Metropolises such as Mexico City, Caracas, Bogotá, São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Buenos Aires, and Santiago de Chile grew exponentially. A gleaming new city, Brasilia, rose from the central plateau of Brazil, built by a developmentalist government that promised to fast forward the country 50 years in 5. This period not only saw the apparent decline of the hegemony of the landowner class, but also the possibility of a new social, economic, and political order embodied in the rhetoric of desarrollismo, mostly crafted by a team of political economists at the CEPAL, Comisión Económica para América Latina y el Caribe. Thus, for the cultural avant-gardes of this period, the modern existed within a set of coordinates that substantially differed from those of their predecessors in the early decades of the 20th century. While the constructive tradition associated to the modernist canon prevailed in the 1940s and 50s, reflecting the region's steadfast advance towards modernity, the prior debates around local forms of knowledge as equally constitutive of the vocabulary of the avant-garde resurfaced in the 1960s, this time against a very different backdrop. In Latin America, the region's intricate and contradictory transition to modernity had been closely monitored by sociologists and political economists in the 1950s and 70s, most of them affiliated to CEPAL. CEPAL's objective was to cooperate with governments of the region, providing research and analysis in order to aid in the process of social and economic development of Latin American nations. This rhetoric of developmentalism, largely articulated and implemented from CEPAL, with the economic reforms that were applied throughout Latin America in the 1950s and 60s, generated, nevertheless, dissenting perspectives that emerged from its very core. And we can identify teoría de la dependencia and teoría del subdesarrollo as part of these dissenting perspectives. So, at a moment in which the modern appeared, so dependency theorists argued that development under such conditions was not only a delusion, but that it essentially guaranteed the flow of resources and labor from the impoverished peripheries that was necessary to sustain the centers, inherently perpetuating colonial dynamics of exploitation and domination. At a moment in which the modern appeared as a concrete possibility, the fissures in the developmentalist process were also becoming evident. Echoing the critiques and concerns coming from the field of political economy, intellectuals and artists throughout the region manifested a profound investment in negotiating the complexities of modernity and its conflictive relation to underdevelopment. They questioned imposed cultural and aesthetic models. Marking a critical distance from the canon and form of vocabulary of the modern, reclaiming local forms of knowledge as well as popular and vernacular expressions, recognizing the value of cultural manifestations born out of conditions of material poverty, while acutely aware of the potential effects of the byproducts of rapid and intensive industrialization, namely the growing consumer and mass communications cultures. So, in the articulation of a counter-discourse to the rhetoric of developmentalism, it is possible to identify an engagement with the particular social, political, and economic conditions of production of art in the context of dependency and underdevelopment, what we could call an aesthetics of underdevelopment. One could consider this shift as an early instance of what more recently theorists from the modernity coloniality group have defined as epistemic disobedience, whereby the anthropos inhabiting, I open quote by Mignolo, inhabiting non-European places discovered that they had been invented as anthropos by a locus of enunciation self-defined as humanitas, and no longer claims recognition by or inclusion in the humanitas, but engages in epistemic disobedience and delinking from the magic of the Western idea of modernity, its ideals of humanity and promises of economic growth and financial prosperity. In the cultural field, there appeared to be a realization concurrent with the geopolitical reorganization of the world taking place at the time and the circulation of these theories, that an inscription in that mirage called modernity was clearly a double bind. To decolonize by way of epistemic disobedience seemed to be the only way out. So the paradigm shift mapped by the exhibition is heterogeneous and nonlinear, unfolding on different fronts, geographies, and chronological periods. Its first manifestation surfaced in Brazil in the early 1960s, evidence in the departure from the formal language of the modernist canon, namely geometric abstraction, as a modernist aesthetic associated with the ethos of developmentalism. Paradoxically, this aesthetic break also entailed the renewal and transformation of the constructive tradition under a new set of parameters during the 1960s. The late 1960s instead saw the emergence of practices consciously aligned with the postulates of dependency theory, many of which directly addressed the developmentalist project's perpetuation of colonial structures. The artists working in this direction could be seen as working within the logic of conceptualism, albeit a brand of conceptualism that was ideological, context-specific, disengaged from the tautological imperatives of American conceptualism, and in its invocation of cybernetics, information and communications theory, approached the systems aesthetics described by Jack Burnham in the late 1960s. A factographic inflection, to use the 20th century avant-garde term, could be identified in these practices as well. Artists mobilized their commitment to ideological causes through the use of language, information, media such as video, television, and the printed press, as well as the technical language and representation of the social sciences, polls, maps, and statistics, in order to build narratives that placed emphasis on the document and factual registers of reality. It is necessary to point out that in many cases this epistemic break also entailed the structural incorporation of the vocabularies of the popular into avant-garde practices, generating forms of collectivization of experience that fostered social awareness through discursive as well as spatial modes of perception and participation. Together, these multiple manifestations taking place all over Latin America throughout a period spanning roughly 25 years can be seen today as constitutive of a major shift after the experimentation with geometric abstraction characteristic of the modern movements in Latin America. So after this introduction, one of the aspects that I wish to discuss in the brief 4 minutes that I have left is there's, in the exhibition, there was a constant tension between the logic of space as referring to that logic of Cartesian rationality and the logic of place, which refers to the logic of the sensorium and of also lived experience and other epistemologies. And this was played out in most of the sections, most notably in one that dealt with the actual break from that modernist canon in the art of the 1960s, most notably in Brazil, and that was exemplified in the exhibition by works of Lígia Pape and Hélio Oiticica. For me, it was interesting to, specifically in regard to this type of work, of practice, is to divest it of this category of conceptualism, because it was rather not. It operated under, I say, the scheme of what Oiticica had described as new objectivity in 1967, which also meant a survival of the constructive will. So these works exemplify in a way how the tradition, the constructive tradition that prevailed in the Latin American avant-gardes of the 1940s and 50s, through the Grupo Concreto Arte Invención, French, Ruptura, Grupo Neoconcreto in Brazil, was reconfigured. Artists did not depart from that language. They reconfigured it under the logic of place and changed those parameters of configuring that constructive will. And the Parangolés and the Penetrable Tropicalia are very exemplary in that sense, because once you enter Tropicalia, you're entering a place, not a spatial construction, which would be the paradigm or the Russian paradigm from which these other penetrables were developed in the 1950s and 60s. Then there is also an issue which is, for me, this tension also modulated other parts of the exhibition, namely those where I speak of a factographic turn. Factography is a term from the constructivist avant-gardes of the 1920s, and referring to this use of the photographic and the documentary in the works, and which can also be seen as something taken up by conceptualist practices in the 1960s. Many of these works also feature that tension in the sense that they make a critique or articulate a critique of structures such as cartography and the idea of the map, which was an instrument of colonization, but also of a colonial authority that regarded this new world as a space to be conquered and to be colonized and exploited, rather than a place where indigenous peoples lived, where there were different kinds of relation to the land, etc. And this is something that plays out in that other important part of the exhibition, which then in turn generate other readings that revisit other specificities that include this incorporation of the vocabulary of the popular, which I also think is extremely important in considering these practices, notably those of Brazil, where artists unlearned from the modern and learned from the popular, specifically in terms of the popular, not as a sort of paternalistic gesture towards the popular, but thinking that the popular really exists in this idea of the vivencia, which was so important for the Brazilian avant-garde of the 1960s. I think I will leave it up to here and open up for questions and discussions further. Thank you.
Antes de apresentar a nossa próxima palestrante, eu queria dizer que existem algumas pessoas aqui pegando questões do público e, por favor, mandem questões que nós vamos depois tentar, de alguma maneira, responder a todas as perguntas junto com as palestrantes. Bom, vou apresentar então a nossa segunda palestrante da tarde, a Isa Hernandes Velázquez. Ela é professora na Central St. Martin's University of the Arts, London, onde é responsável pelo mestrado de pesquisa em arte e estudos de exposições, em colaboração com justamente o Afterall. Sua pesquisa se concentra, num sentido amplo, em instituições de arte como locais de relevância política e filosófica e na maneira em que a teoria tanto informou quanto restringiu esses esforços políticos. Suas publicações recentes incluem Imagining Curatorial Practice After 1972 and Curating After the Global, a Constituent Education no livro The Constituent Museum, and El Arte de la Instituição en Cohabitar Entre. Muito obrigada pela presença, professora Yaisa.
Thank you to the previous speaker as well, because I think there will be some resonances, at least, there's a kind of temporal synchronicity in both of our papers. And certainly thank you to Andre, to Amanda, and to Natalia, and everyone else at MASP that made this possible. Apologies also, I wasn't planning to read any part of this, but I have just landed on a plane this morning and I am exhausted, so translators and might read bits of this text at some point, but I will try to keep that to a minimum. I'm also trying to see my counter. Oh my God. Okay, 2 minutes gone. Okay, so there you go. So like in London, as elsewhere, these calls to decolonize, however metaphorically we want to interpret that, I think have had quite a salutary effect in a number of cultural institutions. This is a pamphlet put together by students at CSM, some of them ex-students of mine, who in a sense defy the increasingly passive role they've been given by a marketized university and demand direct implication or involvement in the university's management, from its curricula to its recruitment practices to its hiring practices. But as these students from the Rhodes Mass Fall campaign that Nestor mentioned earlier, but the Oxford branch of it, remind us the task was never to diversify, the task was to decolonize. Okay. So the problem, I guess, is the kind of recurrent tendency to do something that we could summarize as, somewhat Christianly, as repent and represent. Okay, deal with your history and then try to represent those that you previously exploited. And these might always look like a preamble to structural change, but it might not always give rise to anything further, which would be, the metaphorical problem that Wang and Young have talked about. But what I'd like to do today is not to talk about universities, but on contemporary art institutions, and in a sense to propose a kind of much longer history than the kind of present one that we are, currently incarnating, in a sense, of calling for the museum to be decolonized or not merely diversified. And I think, there is an erasure of all these previous histories, especially since the establishment of curatorial studies as an academic discipline, which has largely disregarded all these previous histories as not necessarily their concern, which perhaps we need to undo. So the question posed by my title, Can the Museum Liberate Us?, is certainly bombastic, and of course, those of you who are used to going to museums, I don't expect any of you would seriously believe that the museum can indeed perform such a feat. But what it does constantly is to thematize it as social engagement, as useful art, as artivism, and certainly in a different way as aesthetic autonomy. So what I'd like to do is to propose that we take this autonomy in its filiation with liberation, in itself an earlier iteration of the desire for colonization, as in the philosophies of liberation, pedagogies of liberation, etc., rather than aesthetics as a prior term here. Without kind of trying to undo the project that Rolando was talking about this morning, this project of opening way to certain aestheses that might have been defutured by coloniality. I have certain issues, some long-standing issues with the role that aesthetics plays in relation to art specifically, not necessarily to culture at large. Of course, it was aesthetic judgment that was to serve as the judge in itself, since Kant at least, it was aesthetic judgment that would determine the universality of our ability to judge, and on the basis of that, on our ability to rule our own lives, to be autonomous. But of course, this universality of aesthetic judgment that Kant delineates goes hand in hand with the incredible effort recently and painstakingly brought forward by Robert Bernasconi to also give some scientific credence to the notion of race, as you know, or as Bernasconi would argue, and I think quite compellingly. It is to Kant, not accidentally but directly, that we owe the concept of race in its modern form. So I don't think we can think the two differently. I think aesthetic judgment and this primacy of the aesthetic as that which gives arts its kind of particularity or specificity remains problematic in its ability and its recurring ability to create hierarchies at this level. Right? So what I would like to try to imagine instead is what might happen if we demand of museum not a different, not the production or the fostering of different aestheses, but actually different models of autonomy. And for that, I'm going to draw from what Odalise Priosti called the museology of liberation, which of course refers to a long history of radical museological practice that tried to not stop at repenting and representing, but actually to rethink quite radically what a museum could be or should be and where it should be from. Moreover, and I think quite emphatically, this whole tradition does away with any idea that the museum should be politically neutral. And in doing that as well, it does away with this illusion of universality. I'm not doing this, and I hate to say this, I'm not doing this because I think this radical museology tradition is particularly exemplary, or it can be transpolated, or MASP should turn into something like this, but because of its very erasure, because of the way that it doesn't tend to appear in spaces of contemporary art. So, before I lose my voice, I'll start in Grenoble in 1971. This is one of the ICOM conferences. The ICOM is the International Council for Museums. And it was in this place that 18 years later, in 1989, the first academic course in curatorial studies, specifically aimed at contemporary art, would be established in Europe. That in itself, I think, is quite incredible. ICOM, of course, was hardly a beacon of radical thought. It was an association, an unofficial association of so-called museum leaders from North America and Europe, which quickly became affiliated, or became an affiliated body of UNESCO, sharing in the kind of universalist mandate of culturizing the whole world. So in practice, this meant that the model of the museum that had developed in Europe in the 19th century was being exported throughout the world very actively, especially in the early years of ICOM, through what they called regional meetings, where they would go to Africa, Asia, Mexico, et cetera, and tell them how to set up a museum that was up to the standards of European museums. By the way, this kind of rhetoric of being up to a particular standard has returned to the language of ICOM. What happens in 71 is that there is a kind of internal call for democracy. This is the wake of 68. Up until that point, national committees were represented only by a very small minority of members, up to 15 people, I think, per country could vote. So the rest of members were just kind of there to listen and learn. So that already meant that the assembly was quite fictitious, and they wouldn't gain this demand for direct democracy wouldn't be warranted until 3 years later in Copenhagen, where this model of one member, one vote was established. But the other thing that happened was this is what ICOM looked like, so certainly not very radical or very inclusive. So the other thing that happens at ICOM is that speakers like Mario Vázquez from Mexico, whom I'm sure a lot of you know, and who would become director of the Museo Nacional de Antropología, and Stanislas Adotevi from Benin, who some of you might know as one of the kind of main critics of the whole idea of negritude, etc., etc. I know very little about him, but some of you might know more about him. Stood up, and in the midst of this general discomfort with how ICOM was being run, spoke against this very colonial idea of exporting a European model of the museum all over the world. I'm going to now read, so apologies to the translators, but I'll try to do that slowly. Okay, I'm not going to read that bit, but my slides are in the wrong order and my head is not working. But I mean, some of you will read French and can at least get... I would like to depart a little bit from the text and talk about sexual freedom in Denmark. It does look like we need to talk about sexual freedom here and now, but perhaps I'll leave that for later. What the New York Times article says, a challenge to the very concept of the museum was raised by this conference, symbolized in its most radical form by the widely applauded speeches of two black delegates, one African, one American. For Stanislav Adotevi of Dahomey, the museum is dead, in the sense that theological rebels maintain that God is dead. Modern reality, notably in the underdeveloped world, demands the disappearance of museums, he declared. Mr. Adotevi, director of the Institute of Applied Research, derided the museum as a bore and a cemetery. Rather than building institutions that would make Africans passive consumers, he argued, museum people should create centers of living cultural activity. Such a center was described by John Kennard, whom I suppose a lot of you would know also, the director of the Anacostia Neighborhood Museum of the Smithsonian Institute in Washington. The traditional museum, he said, does not involve the public because it doesn't give a damn what people think. Museums have been controlled by the rich and have no concern for the present-day problems, he said. Many curators are just purchasing agents for the rich. His own organization, financed by the Carnegie Grant, seeks to involve a black neighborhood in studies of crime, drugs, housing, unemployment, and education. A young Australian curator, I have no idea who this one is, retorted, most of our institutions are not run directly by idiots, but they are controlled remotely by idiots. He drew laughter and applause, and that's September 13, 1971. I had to read that because I kind of longed to be in the days when you could go to a conference such as this one and hear this kind of talk. Happily been put out. So hopefully some of you would also be familiar with what happens a year later. In Santiago de Chile, 1972, May. And the Unidad Popular government that was still at that point in power invites the ICOM to take to Chile the next roundtable. The roundtable, by the way, is far from obscure. It has been the subject of a great deal of scholarly attention. It's just that quite strangely, it has failed to transcend the world of museum studies into something that speaks to curatorial, or certainly to contemporary art curatorial practice more directly. Certainly being kind of mythologized as the kind of point of origin for our so-called new museology. So the agenda government says, come to Chile, do this, but we're going to do this differently. As a matter of fact, it was Paulo Freire who was invited to act as a convener of the general proceedings, and the inspiration from Freire is clearly there. So this notion of liberation was floating in the air. However, Brazil vetoed his presence there because as members of UNESCO, they were able to do that. So he wasn't physically there, even if he was there in spirit. So previous regional meetings, these meetings where the ICOM went to other places, not the West, to tell them how to set up a museum, had concerned themselves strictly with museological questions of conservation, questions of display, this and the other, the right temperature so that, paper doesn't burn. Invariably bringing being museum experts from Europe and North America to speak to the rest. In fact, since 1969, Georges Rivière and Yvonne Odon, who were directors of the ICOM at the time, have been devising an international curriculum for curators that could be self-dispatched throughout the world so that all curators, all museum curators would learn pretty much the same. I mean, it sounds like a horrifically, imperialist idea, except that also, running a course somewhere like Central St. Martin's, where what we are doing is like welcoming students at, 20 grand a pop so that they can learn to be curators, and then we dispatch them back to wherever they are. Even this kind of imperialist model of education seems to, have the benefit of being free or being locally delivered. Anyway, I digress. So this was, this was the ICOM that arrives in Chile. What they do, though, is that they decide that they're not going to talk about museological concerns. What they're going to do is to invite experts about local problems. Right? So we don't really need to talk about museums because that's what we do. We are experts in museums. So let's just think about the context where we are, the context that we are inhabiting. So in the process, of course, this notion that museum work or curatorial work involved primarily what happened within the exhibition space or within the collection space was completely refused. Museum work is about bringing the outside in. So they identify 4 issues: the role of cultural development in rural contexts, the relationship between museums and urbanization, scientific and technological developments, and the importance of lifelong education. And this issue of development, like the previous speaker talked about, of course, is one of the contentious points, because the idea that development could be achieved without kind of wider structural change was violently refused. Importantly as well, Hugh Severin, who was the director of ICOM in '72, has recalled that the only two people that were allowed to arrive at Chile who were not Latin American themselves was him and the delegate for UNESCO. They were allowed to sit in conversations, but they were not allowed to speak. And all of the conversations were conducted in Spanish or Portuguese or Portuñol. So neither of them understood those languages, so they just had to remain silent and kind of, blah, blah, blah. Which again, without trying to make this the kind of example for everything, it is certainly the case that that paradigm seems to have been radically disrupted. I mean, this notion that perhaps it was local knowledge being exercised in the place in which it had the most direct incidence. We have quite willfully kind of moved away from that. I have just been, I don't know, something like 48 hours trying to get here to speak for half an hour. And we try to convince ourselves that by doing this, we are decentering our perspective, which in the best of cases might be the case. But we should also be alert that we are just also mirroring the perspective of what William Robinson or Leslie Sclair would call the transnational elites. I digress again. So at the end of listening to an agronomist, an urbanist, somebody who worked in a petrochemical museum, but who was also a scientist, and the Peruvian Ministry for Education, talk about the perils of development. This economic or technological development that if it came along without a concomitant revolution in social structures, was only going to refine the means through which the poor, and especially the rural and indigenous poor, were going to be exploited. They suddenly found themselves complicit in this project. Okay, so the ICOM in a way was nothing but another branch of this developmentalist promise that once you reach a particular standard, then you would have a proper museum or a proper society or a property labor market, etc., etc. Out of that, they produced this Declaración de Santiago de Chile, proposing what they would call the integral museum, a museum that, and I'm going to quote as well, should be an institution in the service of society. This has now been integrated into the ICOM definition of the museum. But of course, being in the service of society can mean a variety of things. Politically, it means nothing. But they went further. They said, they should help shape the consciousness of the communities to stimulate those communities to action by projecting forward its historical activities so that they culminate in the presentation of contemporary problems, linking together past and present, and identifying itself with indispensable structural changes and calling forth others appropriate to its particular national context. The Integral Museum demanded that the problems of underprivileged Latin Americans be brought into the museum as its most direct concerns, demanding action in and by itself as a force for their overcoming. If a museum's objects, and for some speakers, this was a logical conclusion, perhaps we don't need a collection anymore. That's not what museums are about. Museums are about liberation. So if the museum's objects were not to be relinquished, they would have to be supplemented, extrapolated, and interrelated in a multitude of ways for it to fit naturally into the panorama of social, economic, and cultural development. I'm quoting here literally as well. The point, in a sense, was not to carry on displaying the past, but to provide this direction for the future, and for a future that had to be worked through collectively. And in a very alert awareness of the immediate context. Okay. So of course, if the roundtable was in May '72, by September, a coup d'etat had done away with the Chilean path to socialism. And with it, perhaps it did away as well with the most immediate context for this integral museum to take shape. it's had, we are not going to have time to talk about the afterlives of the Mesa Redonda de Santiago de Chile, but it has had a fruitful afterlife in other places, not a perfect one by any means. Perhaps most exemplary has been the Mexican Museum, that I'm sure some of you are also familiar with. Mario Vázquez, who was one of the speakers in the 71 roundtable that I mentioned before, was also involved in this early, perhaps timid, but for the time radical museological exercise, the Casa del Museo, where holdings, parts of the collections would leave the kind of usual site of the museum and go to neighborhoods where they became something to be handled, engaged with, etc., etc. The pioneering program of museos escolares, so school museums that were actually created in the school and maintained by the school community rather than something that school children went to visit, peaked at some point with approximately 600 small museums embedded in schools, etc., in the 60s as well. All of them managed by the National Institute of Anthropology and History, the INA. It would be the INA as well, which eventually would give support to the network growing, expanding, and ever-present of so-called community museums. Okay. In '86, the Shandani Community Museum in Santa Ana del Valle in Oaxaca is normally credited with shifting the dynamic up until this point with the Casa del Museo and the Museos Escolares. It had been the INA that had provided the resources, the expertise, the kind of scholars that would need to give direction to the whole thing. And what happens with Shandani is that there is a sense of devolving a lot of the responsibility onto the community. This is a well-known story, and I'm sure that some of you will know it, so I won't give too much detail. But rather than designing a museum, I'm going to, I as an expert, as a museologist, as somebody that's sanctioned by the ICOM, would decide what this museum should look like, what heritage or patrimony or something valuable that should be collected should look like, and then giving it to you to preserve it. I'm going to involve, we are all going to be involved in this process of decision-making, not just allowing you to take part in my decisions, but also respecting your own ways of making decisions. The Shandani was largely constructed alongside the Zapotec community in Santa Ana, and if you read the reports, I obviously don't have first-hand experience of this, but if you read the reports, the process was nothing but friction. It was by no means frictionless, of course. Consensus building is never an easy thing. But they did manage, they celebrated 25 years in 2011, so, they're still going. What I think they did manage, and this model of museum did manage, was to retain this sense of collective ownership, and in a sense not to disappear away the minute that direct support from the INA was withdrawn. Crucial to its success then was the fact that this community museum did not rely on the expertise of a team of curators, strangely enough. Instead, devolving its management to non-professional grassroots organization. Carmena and Morales, who are the two members of INA who have engaged themselves with the museum in Santa Ana most directly, have actually also refused the idea that their museum owes anything to the Declaration of Santiago de Chile. So as far as they're concerned, the museum is just the product of the community consensus building rather than anything that the Santiago de Chile Declaration allowed to happen. This way of telling of self-historicizing is probably falsified because the INA's interest in supporting this project was triggered necessarily by the debates of Santiago. But it does give you a sense of the way in which something can, as an institution, gain this autonomy even from the initial model of institution that it was meant to incarnate. Okay, and at this point, for example, in Italy, the network of community museums has decided they don't want to belong to the culture ministry, and they don't even want to call themselves museums because they've created something else entirely. Okay. So in this schema, rather than being the star of the show, as we have become accustomed in the world of contemporary art, the curator is simply a vanishing mediator. So my point, then I'm going to conclude because I have 3 minutes, is not to use the community museum to suggest their simple translocation, right? In a sense, a significant commitment of these museums would be this indissoluble link between community heritage and territory. So trying to translocate them is in itself intrinsically wrong. It's just impossible and undesirable. Moreover, I would say we should be wary of a term such as community, which is so central to them, whose political flexibility, like that of the people, you are probably suffering that now, has been well tested. In fact, despite their opposing political intentions, the community museums, in many ways, always is at risk of moving towards what has been called its perverted forerunner, which is the Heimat Museum in Germany in the 30s, those museums that were constantly pandering to the sense of community as an exclusionary rather than integrating mechanism. Any appeal to an existing community, whether it is in Santa Ana or elsewhere, is problematic, and certainly we should be wary of fetishizing it. However, let me just jump. Oh, minute and a half. I'm just getting to the end. I'm just going to improve. It doesn't matter. So in a sense, we cannot, there is no way that we can simply say, okay, what contemporary art institutions should be is opening them, they should just open themselves up to community management, assembly, decision-making, etc., etc. But it is nevertheless striking, given the willingness with which they thematize the issue of liberation and its subsequent avatars, such as decolonization, they have been so unwilling to just take stock of this history, take stock of the fact that their own institutional tenets might be modified and kind of thought anew. The rise of curatorial studies, as I was saying as well, has increasingly led curators to concentrate on the exhibition as a kind of meta-artistic arena, where, perhaps questions of aesthetics can come to the front, but where institutional mores are seen as something to be escaped from. I mean, someone that I don't normally quote, but Jens Hoffman would literally say that the rise of the curator involves the emancipation of the curator from the institution. This emancipation, so this model of autonomy or liberation, if you want, what it does is to relieve you from the burden of institutional change. And I think that those kind of triangulated relationships between how we understand our roles in this, what role autonomy is playing here, who is it liberating, and what is aesthetics for, need to be kind of pieced apart more carefully. So the point is, or my final point would be that the institution can, if we want it to be, become a tool for communal emancipation, for communal liberation. It can foster a collective and instituting autonomy, an autonomy that's not just for those who can claim the universal, but an autonomy that is only autonomy because it can generate more autonomy. One that's not understood as freedom from institutional norms, but as the freedom to collectively institute such norms. And this is not to be achieved through the virtual or virtuous deployment of an individual methodology, a la Harald Seaman, a la individual curator, but through the frustratingly protracted rehearsal of a collective subjectivity. So I think that as we try to think of a curatorial or museological practice that takes on the challenge of decolonization, this still strikes me as one of our most urgent tasks. So I'll leave you with that.
Thank you so much for the presentations. Now I think we are going to try to speak in Spanish or in Portuñol, as you mentioned. Let me start with a question to Julieta. Julieta, aonde está Cuba nas memórias do subdesenvolvimento, para além do título? Já que Cuba estava tão presente na consciência americana nos anos 60 e 70.
Sorry, perdón. Es una pregunta que me han hecho en múltiples ocasiones, y si hay una razón muy específica. La exposición, como lo expliqué anteriormente, hace una cartografía de estas prácticas que se desarrollan en resistencia a la retórica del desarrollismo. Sin embargo, el momento histórico de la exposición comienza justo después de la Revolución Cubana. Entonces, mientras Cuba era vista como un modelo, ya en ese momento los artistas no estaban reaccionando en contra de esa retórica, estaban, digamos que en otra dinámica, que no respondía a esos parámetros que trata de reseñar la exposición. No sé si eso contesta.
Muito bem. Aqui é uma pergunta que eu vou ter que contradizer a pergunta, porque a pergunta é a seguinte: uma forte estratégia colonial foi apartar o Brasil da América Latina. I'm going to translate here. Nesse sentido, por que reproduzir essa diferenciação falando em inglês, quando se poderia falar em espanhol? É possível pensar em estratégias coloniais, reproduzindo estratégias decoloniais, reproduzindo estratégias coloniais.
A mí me encanta coger micrófono, o sea, que yo lo hago en español, después lo hago en inglés, no tengo problema.
Bueno. Hablamos los dos, si no vamos a estar discutiendo.
No, pero mira, yo de todos modos, a ver, si saqué a colación lo de que justamente en la mesa de Chile dijeran, no, mira, aquí vamos a hablar en español, ustedes, o en español en portugués, quien venga, que por otro lado tampoco vamos a llamar los lenguajes no coloniales, porque hasta ahí podíamos llegar, ¿no? Pero para mí lo importante allá, que el lenguaje vehicular sí que tiene su importancia, claro, porque excluye, incluye y todo esto. Pero al final también tiene que ver con el tipo de conocimiento. O sea, que al final estamos siempre translocando nuestro conocimiento allá a donde no tiene valor político ninguno. Allá donde nosotros no nos vemos atravesados por esos problemas, ¿sabes? Siempre, quiero decir, tú se supone que derivas tu conocimiento de un contexto concreto que te atraviesa políticamente, pero en esta especie de circuito mercado académico, paraartístico, como lo quieras llamar, lo que hacemos continuamente es vivir extrapolándolo a otro lado, allá donde también se neutraliza. Entonces, para mí tiene más que ver con la especificidad del conocimiento que lo del idioma también es verdad. Ahí ahora me pongo a hablar con acento con portugués. No sé, pero quiero decir, para mí es eso que es quizá clave también, ¿no? Porque la fantasía que a veces nos queremos creer, como que viajando mucho, eso nos descentramos. A lo mejor nos estamos alimentando demasiado el ego con eso. A lo mejor, además incluso, ¿no? Pues hablamos de ecocidio. Quizá tendría más sentido estar más activos como académicos, como escolares, como artistas, como curadores, como lo que sea, en las comunidades donde nos vemos más atravesados y participar activa, pero remotamente en nuestro circuito global, ¿no? Que es una propuesta de aquel momento y no es que te la quiera dogmáticamente defender, pero era lo que se planteaba ya.
Sí.
Shall I say it super quickly in English? Or
Yes,
yeah?
yeah.
Okay. Anyway, what I was just saying is that perhaps my point wasn't so much about the language itself, which is certainly important, and it does serve to include and exclude, etc., etc. But then, of course, Spanish and Portuguese were in themselves colonial languages at that point, and one of the obvious criticisms of the two roundtables is that they certainly at that point did not include any indigenous people. I mean, Mario Vázquez was, but it was the elite, the cultural elite of those countries at the time. But it's about the kind of specificity of knowledges that in this kind of circuit of transnational academic elites, we tend to imagine, perhaps for our own self-benefit, that what we know is equally relevant wherever we are. And I do think that is a phantasmatic illusion, that there might be another way of intervening, which means that you are much more active wherever it is that you are traversed by local problems, and you participate remotely in global conversations, which are inevitable. I'm not calling for some kind of localism, which is not, well, whatever. Anyway.
vocês duas falaram da importância das questões políticas, né, na formação desse novo museu não colonial. Então, eu perguntaria a vocês duas de que maneira... Eu sei que Julieta trabalhou mais nos anos 60 e nos anos 80, até os anos 85, mas eu pediria um esforço das duas. Acho que essa onda conservadora não está só no Brasil, mas está também na Europa, nos Estados Unidos, na Inglaterra, em particular, não é? Então, quais são os desafios para museus que têm perspectivas decoloniais nesse contexto da radicalização da direita e nesse contexto da radicalização do autoritarismo, não só no Brasil, como no resto do mundo?
Bueno, desde una experiencia propia y trabajo en un museo que dirijo desde la parte artística, que no se plantea para nada dentro de esos parámetros, y porque es un museo que pertenece a un individuo, es un museo privado y además es administrado por un corporativo y una administración que viene de una empresa que está acostumbrada a hacer ganancias muy cuantiosas a partir de la explotación de trabajadores en una fábrica. Entonces, es un tema muy difícil para mí como curadora pensar en cómo descolonizarse de ese modelo en particular, y para mí hacer exposiciones que aportan una perspectiva crítica desde el arte contemporáneo es una manera de hacerlo dentro de las posibilidades muy limitadas que tengo de hacerlo en el contexto específico del museo donde trabajo. Ahora bien, en otro museo donde trabajé, que es este, MASP, y que ha sido una de las experiencias más gratificantes en lo profesional que he tenido en mi vida, creo que ya hay un trabajo hecho tan grande a partir de una historia del museo, a partir de una filosofía del museo que está presente incluso en su propia arquitectura. El hecho de que Lina escogió trabajar esta idea de una materialidad pobre, es decir, aparente, donde la estructura también fuera aparente, donde ese aspecto inacabado que caracteriza esa obra gris también del tercer mundo fuera aparente, ya también permeaba otra serie de transparencias o cosas que se hacen aparentes en su programación, desde un principio también con a mão do povo brasileiro, que tuve pues, el honor de poder reinstalar con Adriano y Tomás Toledo hace 2 años. Fue una exposición que se plantea en ese momento en que se abre este museo, que es uno de los más importantes de América Latina, y en el contexto de una dictadura que acababa de recrudecerse con la promulgación del Acto Institucional número 5 en el 68, presentar al lado de las obras maestras de la colección, obras maestras de la tradición europea, esta producción de ese Brasil pobre y subdesarrollado, fue realmente un gesto de provocación y ciertamente puede verse también como una instancia muy temprana de esto que hoy, a partir de los 90, llamamos descolonización en el campo de la cultura. Pues creo que sí.
Ok. A ver, mejor en inglés. Yo no me he hecho un lío. Vale. En términos de qué es lo que hay que hacer, a mí me supera la pregunta, y efectivamente sí, en Gran Bretaña también estamos viviendo una ola de giro a la derecha radical, excepto que en las formas, no sé si en la estructura, pero en las formas da menos miedo que la que estáis viviendo ustedes, desde luego, que es literalmente aterradora. Lo que supongo que, a ver, para mí estoy utilizando la institución y no la obra como, digamos, una unidad mínima de inteligibilidad. Claro, a mí me gusta pensarlo del Museo Decolonial de una manera como radical, justamente no como este ejercicio de arrepentirse y representar, sino de decir, vamos a hacer un ejercicio de imaginación institucional. ¿Qué puede ser un museo? Que a lo mejor no tiene nada que ver con lo que automáticamente identificamos como museo. Porque a lo mejor, pues yo qué sé, pues mantienes la palabra a lo mejor, pero bueno, ¿qué es lo que prometía el museo al final? prometía autonomía, prometía un encuentro con algo que te decía a ti mismo, mira, pertenezco, ¿vale? O sea, aquí yo llego, tengo una experiencia estética, esta experiencia estética me sirve de aseguranza epistémica para decir yo soy capaz de ser un sujeto autónomo. O, conversamente, no tenías una experiencia estética y entonces esto era una especie de cosa no humana, o por lo menos no sujeta y no autónoma. En cualquier caso, lo que creo que sí ha habido es grados interesantes de experimentación institucional que sí que sirven, o sea, porque yo no sé acá, pero yo en los sitios en los que habito, en Londres desde luego, y en España hasta cierto punto, y en Canarias también, lo que no hay es sitios donde encontrarnos, sitios que no estén mediatizados o mediados por un encuentro comercial. Sitios donde hablar, donde negociar, donde tener que justamente acordar unas ciertas normas de convivencia. Y esto es lo que puede hacer un museo, ¿no? O sea, hay experiencias también, digamos, que no están tan basadas en este modelo particular que sale de México. Yo qué sé, a mí en España, por ejemplo, la experiencia de la casa encendida, la experiencia de la tabacalera, que son espacios autogestionados supuestamente de ocupas, pero vamos, que han conseguido tener programaciones sin nada prácticamente, aparte de un edificio tan buenas como muchos museos, yo creo que por lo menos deberían de tenerse en consideración cuando estamos hablando de reforma institucional, ¿no? O sea, pero me da la sensación de que estos modelos como que nos molestan demasiado porque hasta cierto punto ponen en solfa o ponen en riesgo nuestra propia estabilidad profesional, que también es difícil de aceptar por razones justificables también. Estamos ya todos demasiado precários.
Julieta, na sua apresentação, você disse que ia, sobretudo, tratar das questões teóricas que envolveram a pesquisa para a exposição Memória do Subdesenvolvimento. Mas, ao fundo, enquanto você falava, temos aqui agora, muitas imagens eram projetadas, né? Como estamos falando do espaço do museu e da arte, você poderia nos falar um pouco como é que esses conceitos se conectam com essas imagens que você nos projetou, ou falar de alguma sala em especial?
Sí. Para mí nunca la idea fue, y nunca lo es, en general, en mi práctica como curadora, ilustrar una teoría con obras de arte, y siempre más bien ha sido todo lo contrario, y este es un intento más de justamente evidenciar cómo este tipo de pensamiento que aparece en el horizonte teórico en los años 90 ya había sido anticipado por una serie de prácticas artísticas varias décadas antes, es decir, hasta 30 años antes, en el caso de Brasil. Entonces, justamente parte de esa idea de cómo los artistas se anticipan a la formulación de estos discursos teóricos, y en su momento se relacionan con otro cuerpo teórico, pero que no pertenece al arte o al campo de la cultura, que es la teoría de la dependencia, que es más pues, una teoría dentro de la formulación de la economía política. Entonces, hablando de algún espacio en particular, bueno, antes hablé un poquito de la Tropicalia de Oiticica, de los parangolés. Ligia Pape tiene una presencia muy singular en toda la exposición, ella está en todas las secciones, con distintas piezas, desde su película, desde su film Catití, Catití, que de hecho coexiste con un fragmento de Tierra en Trance de Glaube Rocha en la exposición. Y luego voy a hablar de esa sala en la que vieron que aparece en la cadeira Beira de Estrada de Lina Bobardi, que para mí esa sala representa el germen de lo que fue esta exposición en mi cabeza, en mi pensamiento, y muy precisamente pensando en lo que pasó en Brasil durante esos 4 años del gobierno de João Goulart, que terminan infelizmente en un golpe de Estado en el año 64. Porque fueron una serie de rupturas muy importantes, no solo a nivel formal de estos artistas que transforman su práctica porque desaprenden ese canon occidental y de la abstracción geométrica y lo reaprenden desde otra serie de parámetros que yo llamo, que son lo que yo califico como aquellos del lugar, y justamente la Tropicale Oiticica es muy ejemplar en ese sentido, pero también es un momento en que se dan otra serie de transformaciones en Brasil desde la formación de los CPCs, que si bien tienen aspectos cuestionables, creo que la bandera de lo popular me parece fue retomada por estos artistas de una manera muy interesante. Y lo popular no como una bandera nada más ideológica, política o panfletaria, sino más bien cómo pensar en lo popular en los términos en los que lo habían definido teóricos o estudiosos del arte popular como Clarivaldo Prado Valadares, que habla de lo colectivo y de la vivencia. Conceptos que se transportan de manera muy particular a las vanguardias brasileñas de los años 60 y de cómo ellos reformulan esa tradición constructiva hacia una práctica que está basada en la vivencia y en la participación y en un espíritu colectivo, y eso está tomado estrictamente de lo popular y de esa experiencia que ellos tienen de lo popular. De Oiticica viviendo en Mangueira y siendo pasista en una favela, en una escuela de samba, de Lígia Pape también aprendiendo de la arquitectura de la favela, cuando también habla de la favela de Amaré y da clases de arquitectura, enseñando esa otra espacialidad que genera la pobreza, etcétera. Entonces, creo que esa sala en particular habla mucho de eso, pero también incluía una sección sobre Mal do Povo Brasileiro, que ya no voy a hablar porque ya estuvo en este museo, y ya espero que lo hayan visto hace 2 años, pero bueno, sí.
Bom, Yaisa. Na sua apresentação aqui para o MASP, você se propôs a falar do legado da museóloga brasileira Odalice Priosti. Você não pôde falar, né? Não sei pelo tempo, mas você nos falaria um pouco sobre a museologia da libertação e aqui, enfim, é uma pergunta até semelhante à da Julieta, mas enfim, o que você encontrou, por que você fez esse tipo de proposta?
Al final, bueno, en parte porque, como siempre, uno piensa que tiene más tiempo del que tiene. Por supuesto, o sea, a mí te voy a contar cómo me la encontré, porque en realidad yo no he visitado los museos de Odalice Priosti, con lo cual realmente, siendo sensata, lo lógico no es hablar de lo que ella... Lo que he hecho es leerme su tesis doctoral, que escribió pues 7 años antes de fallecer, que se llamaba, el subtítulo era Museología de la Liberación, Resistencia e Hibridación. Lo que me parecía, la encontré por una carta o sea, por una discusión, digamos, online, y por la respuesta que le hace Pierre Maynard a una serie de puntualizaciones que ella hacía. Básicamente, ella empieza a ver que la nueva museología está totalmente despolitizándose, que habían habido unos digamos, compromisos iniciales ligados a este proyecto liberacionista que empiezan a dejarse de lado justamente a favor de la inclusividad, o sea, una cosa bastante más light, pero en la que... bueno, se puede mantener el término nueva museología, se puede seguir apelando a la Mesa Redonda de Santiago. En Gran Bretaña, desde luego, esto fue lo que sucedió con la nueva museología, que en gran parte fue la que, por ejemplo, informó la política cultural de Tony Blair, donde todo parecía muy amable, pero estaba realmente despojado de ese núcleo de proyecto. O sea, hablábamos esta mañana, al final lo importante no es si lo llamas de la liberación, de la decolonización, lo importante al final es que aquí hay un proyecto político vivo. Y la encontré así, o sea, con una intervención así airada en la que tal. Y luego ya pues le seguí la pista. Me gusta, digamos, como contrapunto a lo que, o sea, me gusta el llamarlo museología de la liberación. Yo tengo un poco de recelo frente a la manía de estar siempre, digamos, innovando terminológicamente sin necesariamente innovar conceptualmente. Entonces, me gusta también, si vamos a pensar en descolonización, seguir pensándolo como una nueva iteración de un proyecto anterior como La Liberación, con todos sus problemas. Pero estos proyectos son transgeneracionales, es decir, o sea, es que también creo que esto es importante, o sea, hay urgencias políticas, pero los compromisos políticos son de padres a hijos y de hijos para allá, es decir, o sea, no podemos estar siempre haciendo tabula rasa, ¿no? Y, por ejemplo, olvidarse de los legados de la museología en los estudios curatoriales, para mí es sintomático de esto, ¿no? O sea, es siempre muy fácil darte la medalla de radical cuando te has olvidado de todo lo que ha venido antes, que a lo mejor es justo aquello contra lo que estás luchando ahora. Y por ahí me he encontrado, Alice. Tengo el propósito de, por un lado, visitar el Museo de Santa Cruz y, por otro lado, publicar algo que, digamos, habla más directamente de ella. Es verdad que es un poco de cop-out, porque a lo mejor podría haber hablado más de ella hoy aquí, pero también venía en el avión diciendo yo estoy como una cabra, ¿cómo se me ocurre ir a Brasil a hablar de Alice Priostino? Pero bueno.
Tudo bem. Julieta, há uma pergunta aqui perguntando se você estabeleceria um paralelo entre o futurismo e o desenvolvimentismo como valores, em função de abolir o passado e criar uma outra narrativa?
No. Creo que el futurismo pues, responde a una realidad netamente europea, y bueno, de hecho Marinetti vino a Brasil en el año 34 y se encuentra con los artistas modernos. Yo creo que el desarrollismo en el arte como tal no existe, se identificó con el lenguaje modernista y con la arquitectura moderna, porque fue la manera de hacer más visible también este progreso económico, y bueno, el ejemplo más claro es Brasilia, por ejemplo, pero no tiene nada que ver. Son
Ok. Bom, e a Isa? Se eu entendi bem a questão, a pergunta é, como você entenderia a introdução de objetos em museus coloniais, como se colocam em museus coloniais os objetos originais dos países, e, ao contrário, o que fazemos quando, como colocar, que acho que foi o que você falou um pouco, fazer museus comunitários com objetos comunitários. Do you want me to translate it? So, the two sides. One side is...
Oh, okay.
Okay?
Bueno, seguramente yo no soy la persona más indicada para... yo soy como una comisaria frustrada que era muy mala y me echaron de comisaria. Bueno, me eché yo misma, pero para el caso es igual. Lo que... Claro, a ver, es que depende, obviamente, del museo que tengas. También creo que tenemos que tener cuidado, digamos, de hacer como cultos a la pura horizontalidad. O sea, la horizontalidad sin fricción es siempre peligrosísima, ¿no? O sea, corramos muchísimo. En los museos comunitarios, normalmente esto, tanto el qué se va a exponer como el cómo se va a exponer, se decide por parte de grupos dentro de la propia comunidad que se hacen responsable de esto. Es cierto que muchas veces, por ejemplo, las estrategias de display que tienen son bastante ortodoxas, quiero decir, que no es tampoco, sí. Y de conservación y de tal, o sea, que al final el patrimonio está elegido por digamos, la propia constituency, ¿no? La propia comunidad del museo, pero las maneras de curar o de comisariar, propiamente dichas, son bastante tradicionales, ¿no? No sé cuál es la fórmula, lo que sí que creo que, es decir, para mí, además de la experiencia estética, que desde luego no me parece desdeñable, lo que pasa que sí que hay que tenerle cuidado, ¿no? O sea, porque las experiencias estéticas son inevitables, las estamos teniendo todo el tiempo, sobre todo en el sentido de aesthesis, ¿no? O sea, si no estamos hablando de una estética en el sentido 1800, Kant, o sea, claro, directamente pues estéticas tenemos todo. Y por supuesto que la manera en que asemblamos y los afectos se unen con el pensamiento, incluso con la pasión política, es importante. O sea, la forma no deja de ser importante. Pero o sea, para mí el museo sobre todo tiene esa capacidad de convocar y de ser lugar de encuentro, y de choque, y de negociación, y de Entonces, bueno, a lo mejor la manera de hacerlo es de manera, no sé, pues más negociada, sin tanto experto, quizá, ¿no? Pero...
Penso que vou fazer mais uma questão para as duas. Ambas falaram um pouco de América Latina. A América Latina, que é um conceito criado pelo Ocidente, não é? Ambas também falaram um pouco das especificidades de fazer uma arte da América Latina, ou uma vanguarda da América Latina. Como vocês reagiriam a essa questão, uma vez que esse seminário se chama Arte e Descolonização? Julieta.
Yo recalcaba en mi exposición y el texto justamente esta idea de Jorge Glusberg de que no hay un arte de América Latina, sino un problema de América Latina, y que en relación a eso se definen una serie de prácticas. Y sí, para mí un poco dentro de esto hay un reclamo de especificidad, y en parte también por ello quería sacar este tipo de arte que presenté en la exposición, que había sido consignado a esa lógica de lo conceptual, de esa categoría que me parecía bastante estrecha y que no daba cuenta de las complejidades y de ciertas especificidades también que entraron en la producción de este tipo de arte, que si bien tampoco esta idea del subdesarrollo da cuenta tampoco de ello, lo que traté fue abrir campos para entender este arte dentro de una relación específica con el contexto. Y bueno, y no solo de América Latina, sino de su contexto más inmediato también.
A mí que me hagas hablar de América Latina me pone muy nerviosa, porque desde luego no soy la persona más indicada para hacerlo aquí. Pero bueno, a ver, en el sentido en el que yo utilizo el término, y lo utilizo, quiero decir, lo utilizo también porque estoy hablando de este contexto histórico, donde creo que, entre otras cosas, es una alianza estratégica, ¿no? Quiero decir, es un problema, y es un problema que compartimos. Y en ese sentido también, bueno, pues esto, ¿no? O sea, los términos, como decíamos antes, nacen y mueren, o por lo menos ciertas acepciones o ciertas valencias políticas de los términos tienen sus historias, ¿no? Me parecía como un tanto falsificante utilizar cualquier otra terminología para estar hablando del año 72, ¿no? Porque aparte que hubiera sido una mala representación de los problemas que de hecho se atacan allí, que distan mucho yo qué sé, de hablar de Avellala, porque es que no. O sea, en ningún momento que yo sepa, aparte de hablar de los pobres y de los indígenas, se habla del problema de indigeneidad, por ejemplo, o algo así. O sea, que sí.
Muito bem, queria agradecer as duas, né? Dizem que perguntar é uma forma de desobedecer, né? E também eu penso que falamos aqui em portunhol, não? Em spam português também. E queria agradecer muito ao esforço de todas vocês e dizer que, vocês duas são melhor, lindas respostas, e dizer que nós temos ainda uma conferência que começa às 16h30, chamada Descolonizando a Estética Negra, pelo professor Lewis R. Gordon. Eu penso que o tema que nós tratamos aqui vai retornar, né, nessa conferência, então nós só estamos começando. Muito obrigada a todos, muito obrigada, sobretudo, a vocês duas.